My blind date took one look at my salt-stained work boots and made a pathetic excuse to walk out. But the industrial mechanic sitting at the bar next to me didn't let me sink into humiliation. He just gestured to his own grease-covered steel toes and said, "Don't worry, mine are worse." And what started as a quiet, late-night split of a diner plate turned into a story about two people who realized that real value isn't about being polished, it's about finding someone who doesn't mind getting dirty alongside you. Gwen Alvarez was walking out of the Sub-Zero pharmaceutical storage vault at the Port of Portland shipping terminal at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday night in late November, and her fingers were so numb from her last 90-minute rotation in negative 20-degree temperatures that she could barely work the zipper on her heavy-duty thermal parka when she got back to the break room. 30 years old, cold chain logistics inspector for a pharmaceutical shipping contractor, and she spent 40 hours a week inside massive commercial freezers that were bigger than most people's houses, verifying temperature seals on shipments of insulin and vaccines and biologics that would be worthless if they thawed even 1 degree above protocol. The job paid $62,000 a year, which was decent for someone without a 4-year degree, and the night differential added another $3 per hour, but it meant her entire life ran on a schedule that was inverted from normal human existence, sleeping during daylight and working while the rest of Portland was home with their families. She clocked out at 11 and was supposed to meet a guy named Julian for drinks at 11:30, a blind date her cousin had set up with someone from her marketing firm, and Gwen had planned to swing by her locker to change into the clean jeans and sweater she kept there, specifically for situations like this, where she needed to look like a normal person instead of someone who worked in industrial refrigeration. The problem was her locker padlock had seized completely, the metal mechanism jammed from dried salt residue that had built up over weeks of use, and she'd spent 10 minutes trying to get it open before accepting that she was either going to skip the date entirely or show up exactly as she was, wearing her insulated work pants and her salt-crusted Timberland safety boots and her thermal parka that was designed for Arctic conditions. She texted Julian saying she'd be there, but might look a little rough coming straight from work, and he'd responded, "No problem, see you soon," with a smiley face. So Gwen figured maybe it would be fine. Maybe he'd understand that some people work jobs that required actual protective equipment. The gastropub was called The Dock, and it was one of those 24-hour places that existed specifically to serve the graveyard shift workers from the terminal and the rail yard in the grain elevators. And it smelled like fried food and strong coffee, and had that fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly jaundiced. Gwen walked in at 11:27 and scanned the bar area, looking for someone who matched Julian's profile picture, and she spotted him immediately sitting at a high-top table near the window, wearing a crisp button-down shirt and dark jeans that looked expensive, and he was scrolling through his phone with the posture of someone who was already regretting this decision. She walked over, and Julian looked up, and his eyes went immediately to her boots, those heavy steel-toed Timberlands that were covered in road salt and chemical residue and had water stains halfway up the leather from walking through the loading dock, where the ice melt pooled. And Gwen watched his expression shift from polite interest to something that looked like embarrassment mixed with distaste. "Hey, I'm Gwen. Sorry I'm dressed like I'm about to climb Everest. My locker jammed and I couldn't change," she said, and she tried to make it sound casual, but she could already feel this date going sideways before she'd even sat down. Julian stood up and did this thing where he glanced around the gastropub like he was checking if anyone he knew was watching him with a woman in industrial work gear, and he pulled out his phone and made a show of looking at the screen with exaggerated concern. "Oh man, I just got a text from my roommate. Apparently there's a burst pipe flooding our apartment, and I need to get back before it gets worse. I've got to run." He said it with the kind of smooth delivery that suggested he'd used this exact excuse before, and Gwen just stood there holding the menu, feeling her face get hot because she knew exactly what was happening. "Your apartment's flooding right this second. That's incredibly convenient timing," Gwen said, and she couldn't keep the edge out of her voice because this was so transparently fake, it was almost insulting. Julian was already grabbing his jacket off the chair, back and heading for the door, and he called over his shoulder, "Sorry, really bad timing. Maybe we can reschedule." And then he was gone, and Gwen was left standing next to an empty table in her work boots, feeling like she'd just been judged and found wanting based on her footwear. She stood there for a long moment trying to decide if she should just leave or if she should salvage what was left of her night by eating alone. And she was leaning toward leaving when a voice from the bar said, "He's an idiot, and those boots are actually rated for safety. Mine have a tear in the leather toe cap from a glycol line." Gwen turned and saw a guy sitting 2 stools down at the bar, mid-30s probably, wearing canvas work pants and a gray thermal Henley that had grease stains on the sleeves, and his boots were propped on the footrest, and they were in significantly worse condition than hers. Steel toes scuffed to hell, and the leather cracked in places from exposure to chemicals. The guy was drinking what looked like club soda with lime, and he had that specific exhaustion around his eyes that Gwen recognized from her own reflection, the kind that came from working overnight in industrial conditions where mistakes could be catastrophic. If you're staying, the kitchen does a half-price midnight breakfast special, bacon and eggs and hash browns for like $7. I was about to order, but I hate eating alone. Want to split a plate? He said it without any obvious agenda, just offering practical information. And Gwen found herself walking over and sitting on the stool next to him because the alternative was going home to her empty apartment and eating cereal over the sink. I'm Gwen. I inspect cold chain pharmaceutical shipments at the terminal. The boots are from walking through the loading dock, where they use enough salt to preserve a whole cow, she said, and she gestured at her Timberlands, which were legitimately disgusting up close. The guy nodded and held out his hand for her to shake, and his palm was rough with calluses, and there was what looked like dried ammonia coolant under his fingernails. Vaughn, I maintain the refrigeration compressor systems at the same terminal, the glycol and ammonia lines. My boots got the tear when a high-pressure coupling failed and sprayed me with coolant at about 200 psi, melted right through the leather. They ordered the midnight special, and the waitress brought them one massive plate with enough food for 2 people, and they ate in this comfortable silence for a few minutes before Vaughn asked what she'd been doing before the date disaster. Gwen explained about the locker situation and tonight's shift in the pharmaceutical vault, checking temperature logs on a shipment of pediatric vaccines that were heading to rural clinics in Eastern Oregon, and Vaughn told her about spending his evening rebuilding a compressor head on one of the main glycol chillers because the motor bearings had seized from contaminated coolant. Most people have no idea that half the medicine in this country moves through refrigerated supply chains that run 24/7. They just assume their prescription shows up at the pharmacy by magic, Vaughn said, and he was using his fork to push hash browns around his plate in this absent way that suggested he was too tired to have much appetite. I've been doing this work for 9 years, and I still can't explain to my family what I actually do. They think I fix home air conditioners or something. Don't understand the scale of industrial refrigeration systems that can cool entire warehouses. Gwen felt something in her relax, hearing him articulate exactly what she experienced trying to explain her job to people who work normal daylight hours in climate-controlled offices. This disconnect between the industrial infrastructure that kept society running and the complete invisibility of the people who maintained it. My cousin who set up that date tonight works in marketing, and she keeps trying to get me to apply for corporate jobs. Says I'm wasting my potential doing manual labor. Doesn't get that I actually like the work, like the precision of temperature monitoring and the satisfaction of knowing a shipment stayed viable because I caught a compromise seal. They split the check and Vaughn left a generous tip, and when they walked out to the parking lot at 12:45, the temperature had dropped into the 20s, and their breath made clouds in the air. Gwen's truck was parked near the street, and Vaughn's was 3 rows over, and they stood in that awkward moment where neither of them was quite ready to end the interaction, but neither knew what the protocol was. I'm here most nights around this time, usually grab food after my shift ends at 11, Vaughn said, and he was digging his keys out of his pocket. If you want company for the midnight special again, I'm usually at that same bar stool. No pressure, just offering. Gwen smiled for the first time since Julian had bailed, and it felt genuine instead of performative. Yeah, I'd like that. Beats eating alone. Plus, you're the first person I've met in months who understands what -20 feels like, shift after shift. Vaughn nodded and headed to his truck, and Gwen climbed into hers and sat there for a minute with the engine running, and she looked down at her salt-stained boots and thought about how Julian had taken one look at them and decided she wasn't worth his time, and how Vaughn had looked at the same boots and seen someone who worked hard in difficult conditions. And that difference felt significant in a way she couldn't quite articulate yet, but knew mattered. What started as one shared midnight breakfast turned into a routine neither of them had exactly planned, but both of them showed up for. And by mid-December, Gwen and Vaughn were meeting at the dock 3 or 4 nights a week after their shifts ended, sitting at the same section of bar and splitting whatever the kitchen was pushing that night. They didn't do traditional dates because their schedules made normal social activities basically impossible. Gwen worked Sunday through Thursday, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and Vaughn worked Tuesday through Saturday, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., which meant their overlap was this narrow window between 11 and midnight, where they were both off the clock and too wired from work to go straight home. The connection built itself in these small incremental ways that felt more substantial than any dinner and a movie date Gwen had been on. And she found herself looking forward to those late-night conversations in a way that surprised her, because she'd gotten so used to her solitary existence. One night in early January, Vaughn noticed Gwen's handheld inventory scanner sitting on the bar next to her jacket, and he picked it up and turned it over in his hands, examining the battery compartment. "This keeps dying on you in the cold storage, doesn't it? Standard lithium-ion batteries lose like 40% capacity below freezing," Vaughn said. And Gwen nodded because, yeah, that was exactly the problem she'd been dealing with for months. "It's supposed to last a full 8-hour shift, but I'm lucky if I get 4 hours before it shuts down, which means I have to come out of the vault to swap batteries, and it throws off my whole inspection schedule," Gwen said. And she'd complained to her supervisor about it multiple times, but the company line was always that the equipment was rated for cold weather, and if she was having issues, it must be user error. Vaughn was already unscrewing the back panel with a small screwdriver from his keychain, and he pulled out the standard battery pack and held it up to the light. "Yeah, this is rated for 32 degrees minimum. You're working in -20. It's not going to cut it, but I can fix this if you let me take it for a couple days." Gwen handed over the scanner without hesitation because she had a backup unit in her locker. And 3 days later, Vaughn showed up at the dock with her scanner in a small canvas tool bag, and when he pulled it out, she could see he'd done significant modifications. The battery compartment now held what looked like a custom-fitted power pack, and the entire handle was wrapped in this textured black grip tape that she recognized as the same thermal material used on industrial valve handles. Swapped out the lithium-ion for a specialized low-temperature lithium iron phosphate cell pack, rated for -40 degrees, should give you a solid 10 hours of runtime even in your coldest vault, Vaughn said, and he handed it to her. "The grip tape is so your heavy gloves don't slip when your hands are numb. It's got this aggressive texture that maintains friction even when it's covered in frost." Gwen tested the scanner, and the difference was immediately obvious. The grip felt secure even through her thick thermal gloves, and the battery indicator showed a full charge that actually seemed accurate. "How much do I owe you for parts? This looks like it took actual time and money," Gwen said, and she was already reaching for her wallet, but Vaughn waved her off. "Parts cost me maybe $30, and I had the grip tape left over from a valve refurbishment project. Don't worry about it. I like solving problems, and this was an interesting one." He said it casually, but Gwen understood that he'd spent several hours of his free time figuring out the battery specifications and fabricating a custom housing, and that felt like the kind of thoughtful gesture she hadn't experienced in any of her previous relationships. A week later, Vaughn mentioned he was constantly behind on his preventive maintenance schedule because he couldn't keep track of which compressors he'd serviced and which ones were coming due, and his supervisor kept writing him about missing inspection intervals. "I've got like 6 different spreadsheets and a paper logbook, and none of them match. I'll check a unit thinking it's due and find out I just did it 2 weeks ago. It's a mess," Vaughn said, and he showed Gwen his phone where he had multiple calendar apps all showing conflicting information. Gwen looked at the chaos and immediately saw the solution, because this was basically the same kind of logistics tracking she did for pharmaceutical shipments. She spent her next night off building Vaughn a comprehensive maintenance tracking system, using the same route optimization software she used for her vault inspections, and she created a color-coded laminated calendar that showed every compressor unit in the terminal, with service intervals marked in different colors: red for critical monthly checks, yellow for quarterly inspections, green for annual overhauls. She printed it on waterproof synthetic paper and laminated it at the FedEx store. And the next time she saw Vaughn, she handed him the calendar and a pack of dry erase markers. I left this on your tool chest. It's organized by zone and equipment ID number. Mark it when you complete each service, and the colors will tell you what's coming due. Should keep your supervisor off your back. Vaughn looked at the calendar like she'd just handed him the solution to a problem that had been plaguing him for years. And when he looked back up at her, his expression was this mix of gratitude and something deeper that Gwen couldn't quite name. You made this from scratch. This is actual professional logistics planning. This is better than what our facilities manager uses, Vaughn said, and he was running his finger across the laminated surface tracing the color-coded zones. Thank you, seriously. This is going to make my life so much easier. They didn't hug or make a big deal about it, just went back to their split plate of chicken fingers and fries, but something had shifted in how they related to each other. This recognition that they were both people who showed care through practical problem solving rather than romantic gestures. February came in with an ice storm that shut down half the city but didn't touch the terminal because critical infrastructure didn't get snow days. And Gwen and Vaughn found themselves both working extended shifts to cover for coworkers who couldn't make it in. They'd see each other in passing during shift changes, Vaughn heading into the compressor room with his red rolling tool chest, and Gwen coming out of the pharmaceutical vault with frost in her hair. And they'd exchange these brief, exhausted greetings that felt more intimate than long conversations, because they were the only two people in that massive facility who understood what it meant to keep working while the rest of the city stayed home. One night around 3 a.m., Gwen's shift got extended because a shipment of monoclonal antibodies came in with questionable temperature logs, and she had to do a full verification before they could be accepted. And she ended up doing multiple back-to-back rotations with minimal warm-up breaks between them. And when she finally came out at 6 in the morning, she was so cold and tired she could barely walk straight. She found Vaughn in the break room making coffee because his shift had also been extended for emergency compressor maintenance, and he took one look at her and just handed her his insulated mug of coffee without saying anything. And Gwen drank half of it before her hands stopped shaking. I was in there so long my core temperature dropped to like 95 degrees. I had to check it with the medical thermometer because I started getting confused about what I was reading on the data logs, Gwen said. And she was sitting on the break room couch, wrapped in the emergency blanket from the first aid kit. Vaughn sat down next to her and started explaining the physics of hypothermia and how the body prioritizes core organs. And it was exactly the kind of technical conversation Gwen needed, instead of empty sympathy. Just two people who worked in extreme conditions, discussing the realities of their jobs without drama. They started coordinating their grocery shopping for 4 a.m. because that was when the 24-hour Safeway was completely empty, and they could get in and out in 20 minutes. And they'd run into each other in the frozen food aisle and make small talk about meal prep and whether the store brand coffee was adequate or if it was worth spending extra for the good stuff. They'd drive the empty highways at dawn when their shifts ended, and Gwen would see Vaughn's truck in her rearview mirror on the route home. And there was something comforting about knowing someone else was out there navigating the same inverted schedule. One night in late February, they were sitting at the dock, and Gwen mentioned her ex-fiancé, first time she'd brought up her past relationships, and she told Vaughn about how Daniel had worked in finance and had been embarrassed by her blue-collar job, would introduce her at company events as working in logistics without mentioning the pharmaceutical cold chain part because he thought it sounded too manual. He kept pushing me to go back to school for management or get some kind of office job, said I was wasting my potential doing physical labor, and when I had to work an emergency weekend shift during his company retreat, he broke off the engagement, said he needed a partner who could be present for his career milestones. Gwen said it matter-of-factly, but Vaughn could hear the hurt underneath. That's on him, not you. Anyone who can't respect the work you do doesn't deserve access to who you are outside of work, Vaughn said, and he was wiping condensation off his glass with his thumb. I dated someone for 2 years who kept trying to get me to apply for HVAC installer jobs that paid less, but had normal hours. She couldn't handle that I worked nights and weekends, said it felt like being in a relationship with a ghost, ended it because she wanted someone with a 9 to 5. They sat with that shared experience of being judged for their work schedules, and it created this bond that felt more solid than any romantic declaration because it was based on mutual understanding of what they'd both survived. By March, they'd stopped pretending this was just casual friendship and started calling it what it was. Dating, even though their dates looked nothing like what normal people did. Just these late-night meals and early morning grocery runs and occasional texts during their shifts when something reminded them of a conversation they'd had. Gwen's scanner never failed in the cold because of Vaughn's battery modification, and Vaughn's maintenance schedule stayed perfectly organized because of Gwen's color-coded calendar. And they both understood that this was what partnership looked like for people who worked the late shift. Not grand gestures, but practical care that made survival a little easier. Early March hit with a late-season cold snap that dropped temperatures into the single digits and stayed there for a week straight, and the terminal's refrigeration systems were running at maximum capacity, trying to maintain sub-zero temperatures in the pharmaceutical vaults while the outside air was barely above freezing, which put enormous strain on the compressor infrastructure. Gwen was halfway through her Wednesday night shift doing routine checks on a shipment of pediatric vaccines when the facility-wide alarm started blaring. This specific pattern of 3 short blasts that meant ammonia leak detected, and every person in the building knew that sound meant you had about 60 seconds to verify your location before emergency protocols locked down entire sections. The overhead speakers crackled with the facilities manager's voice, calling for all personnel to evacuate non-essential areas. And Gwen grabbed her scanner and headed for the vault exit, and when she made it to the main loading dock, she could see Vaughn already suiting up in the hazmat area near the compressor room. He was pulling on the positive pressure breathing apparatus, this full-face mask connected to a compressed air tank that he wore on his back, and the facilities manager was standing next to him with a clipboard looking stressed as hell because whatever had failed was serious enough to trigger the automated shutdown system. The situation became clear pretty fast. One of the primary glycol compressor lines had suffered what Vaughn called a catastrophic pressure valve failure, which meant refrigerant was venting into the compressor room, and the ammonia sensors had detected contamination levels that made the space immediately hazardous to anyone without breathing protection. The bigger problem was sitting on the loading dock, a refrigerated trailer containing $200,000 worth of temperature, sensitive biologics bound for pediatric clinics across 3 states. And without the compressor running, the trailer's cooling system couldn't maintain the required temperature range, and they had maybe 3 hours before the entire shipment would have to be declared compromised and destroyed. Gwen stood behind the safety glass, watching Vaughn check his air supply and grab his toolkit, and the facilities manager was explaining that Vaughn was the only ammonia-certified technician on site for the shift, which meant he was the only person legally authorized to enter that compressor room and attempt a repair under hazardous conditions. I need to manually purge the contaminated refrigerant from the line and replace the ruptured pressure valve. If the seal holds, we can restart the system and save the shipment. If it doesn't hold, we're looking at a 6-hour shutdown minimum while we wait for the specialty contractor to arrive from Seattle, Vaughn said, and his voice was muffled through the mask, but Gwen could hear the focus in it. This was what he'd been trained for, but it was also genuinely dangerous. She watched him enter the compressor room, and the heavy steel doors sealed behind him with this pneumatic hiss that made the hair on her arm stand up, and through the reinforced observation window she could see him moving through the space with his flashlight because the emergency shutdown had killed the main lighting. The compressor room was pitch black except for the beam of his light, and the temperature in there was probably close to freezing because the heating system had also shut down, and Gwen could see her own breath fogging the observation glass while she watched Vaughn work on the failed valve assembly, his movements deliberate and careful, because one mistake with pressurized ammonia refrigerant could cause serious injury. Her phone buzzed with updates from her supervisor about the vaccine shipment timeline, and Gwen was supposed to be monitoring the trailer's internal temperature logs, but she couldn't make herself look away from that window, watching Vaughn's silhouette move through the darkness, wearing equipment that emphasized just how hazardous his normal work environment actually was. She'd known intellectually that industrial refrigeration work involved chemicals and pressure systems in confined spaces. But seeing him suited up in breathing apparatus with warning labels all over his air tank made the danger feel immediate and real in a way it hadn't before. The repair took 40 minutes, and Gwen stood at that observation window for all 40 of them. And when Vaughn finally emerged and pulled off the breathing mask, his face was red from the pressure of the seal, and he was breathing hard from the physical exertion of working in full protective gear. The compressor restarted with this deep mechanical rumble that Gwen could feel through the concrete floor, and the facilities manager confirmed the vaccine shipment had maintained acceptable temperature range, disaster averted, and everyone on the loading dock was congratulating Vaughn on the successful repair. Gwen slipped away before he could see her because something in her chest had gone tight and wrong during those 40 minutes. This feeling she recognized from 3 years ago when her ex-fiancé Daniel had made her feel like her job was an embarrassing complication in his clean corporate life. Except this time, it wasn't embarrassment, it was fear, raw and specific fear that she was falling for someone whose job involved walking into rooms full of toxic gas, while she stood behind safety glass, helpless to do anything if something went wrong. She finished her shift on autopilot, completed her vault inspections mechanically without really processing the data. And when 7 a.m. came, she clocked out and drove home and sat in her truck in the parking lot, trying to breathe through the panic that had been building for hours. The fear wasn't rational, and she knew it. Knew Vaughn was trained and certified and careful. Knew he'd been doing this work for 9 years without serious injury. But rationality didn't matter because her brain was replaying Daniel's voice telling her that her job was too risky, too unpredictable, too much of a liability for someone trying to build a stable life. And now she was on the other side of that equation, watching someone she cared about take risks she couldn't control. She pulled out her phone and typed a message before she could talk herself out of it, hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Vaughn, I can't do this. Watching you walk into a room with gas masks while I'm trying to survive my own shifts, it makes my chest too tight. I'm too tired to keep waiting for something to go wrong. I think we need to stop seeing each other. She hit send at 7:43 a.m. and then drove home and slept for 12 hours straight. And when she woke up, her phone had no missed calls and no response text, just the read receipt showing Vaughn had seen the message at 8:15 that same morning. What Gwen didn't know was that Vaughn had been sitting in his truck in the terminal parking lot when her text came through, still in his work clothes with grease and dried coolant on his hands. And his whole body was still trembling, slightly from the adrenaline dump that came after high-stress repairs. And he'd read her message 3 times, trying to figure out if she was ending this because of fear or because of something he'd done wrong. He didn't call or text back because he understood that Gwen was processing trauma, recognized the panic in her words as something deeper than just worry about one emergency repair, and he sat in his truck watching the sun come up over the shipping containers, thinking about how his ex-girlfriend had said almost the exact same thing about his job being too much uncertainty. The difference was, Vaughn knew Gwen wasn't asking him to change careers. She was asking to not have to carry the weight of worrying alone, and that was something he could actually address if she'd let him. 3 days went by with no contact, and Gwen threw herself into work, took extra shifts, avoided the dock entirely, and tried to convince herself she'd made the right call, protecting herself from future hurt. She was in the terminal office on Saturday afternoon, filing paperwork for a completed inspection, when she heard the heavy steel door open, and when she looked up, Vaughn was standing there in his canvas work jacket holding something wrapped in an old shop towel, and he didn't look angry or hurt, just determined. He walked over and set the wrapped object on her metal desk with a solid thunk that suggested weight and substance. And when he pulled back the towel, Gwen saw it was a brass pressure gauge, old and beautifully maintained, with ornate engraving on the face that dated it to probably the 1950s when the terminal had first been built. She recognized it immediately because she'd admired it months ago when they'd been walking through the decommissioned equipment storage area. This perfectly preserved piece of industrial history that Vaughn had apparently salvaged and polished until it looked museum quality. This gauge spent 40 years handling 2,000 pounds of pressure without cracking, Vaughn said, and his voice was calm and factual. It's built to take the strain, designed specifically so the weakest point fails in a controlled way that protects the system. That's what good engineering looks like. He pushed the gauge slightly toward her. I didn't take this job because it was easy, and I didn't start seeing you because I wanted an uncomplicated life. I did both because they matter, because we work in the dark so the rest of the world has medicine when they wake up, because you're the first person I've met who understands what that actually costs. Gwen kept her eyes on the brass gauge because looking at his face was too hard, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted. I watched you walk into that compressor room, and all I could think about was my ex telling me my job was too risky. Too unpredictable? And now I'm the one on the outside watching someone I care about do something dangerous, and I don't know how to carry that anxiety. I like my life predictable. Vaughn sat down in the chair across from her desk and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. And when he spoke, his voice had this absolute certainty that cut through all of Gwen's spiraling fear. I can't promise nothing will ever go wrong. I can't guarantee I'll never have to suit up and walk into a hazardous space. That's the nature of maintaining critical infrastructure, Vaughn said, and he picked up the brass gauge and held it in both hands. But I can promise I will never walk out on you because things get hard. I can promise you don't have to carry the pressure alone. Let me hold the other end of the line. That's what this is supposed to be. Partnership, sharing the load, so neither of us has to bear all of it. He set the gauge back down, and Gwen finally looked up at him, saw the grease still under his fingernails and the exhaustion around his eyes, and the complete lack of judgment in his expression. And she realized he wasn't asking her to stop being afraid. He was asking her to be afraid together instead of alone. She reached out and picked up the brass gauge, felt the weight of it, the solidity of metal that had survived decades of pressure and stress, and something in her defensive wall finally cracked. I don't want to lose you to your job, but I also don't want to lose you because I'm too scared to trust this, Gwen said, and Vaughn nodded. Then let's figure it out together. No guarantees except we show up, we communicate, and we don't bail when things get complicated, Vaughn said, and he stood up and held out his hand. Gwen took it and let him pull her up, and they stood there in the terminal office surrounded by the hum of industrial equipment. And Gwen understood that real safety wasn't about avoiding risk. It was about finding someone who knew how to handle pressure and was willing to share the load. 7 months later, on a crisp October evening, the courtyard outside the terminal's historic brick boiler house was strung with simple outdoor lights, and about 40 people were gathered in folding chairs that the night shift dock workers had set up that afternoon. Gwen and Vaughn got married in the space where they'd both spent years working overnight shifts, and their vows were short and practical, promises about showing up and sharing the weight and not walking out when things got hard. The terminal supervisor officiated because he was ordained online, and the reception was hot cider in mismatched ceramic mugs and sheet cake from the bakery down the street. And when they walked down the improvised aisle, their coworkers tapped brass wrenches against metal piping in this quiet, rhythmic salute that sounded like the machinery they maintained. Gwen sat on the tailgate of Vaughn's truck, watching the autumn steam rise from the boiler exhaust vent into the cool night air. And Vaughn sat right next to her, passing her a warm mug of cider. And they hadn't needed a grand rescue or a millionaire's bailout to build a family. Real love didn't belong in a sterile, perfect room. It was forged over grease stains and freezing vaults, and the quiet choice to stand next to someone in the dark. And looking at the polished brass gauge sitting on the dashboard of the truck, Gwen realized they had finally built a foundation that could survive any pressure together.